He built an empire on blood and silence, then walked into a bakery and discovered the one thing his money could never buy back: his daughter. 5 years. She was gone 5 years, and he told himself he'd made peace with it. He told himself the empire was enough. He told himself a man like Jang Tae-hyun didn't need forgiveness. Not from a woman, not from anyone. Then he saw her behind that counter, and every lie he'd ever told himself turned to ash. If you've ever lost someone because you chose power over love, stay until the end. This story will break you open. Drop a like. Comment the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The rain came down in cold, diagonal sheets across the Mapo district of Seoul, the kind of rain that made the neon signs blur into watercolor smears on wet pavement and sent ordinary people ducking into doorways with their collars turned up against the chill. It was the kind of evening that made the city look like something out of a fever dream, beautiful and hostile at the same time, all sharp edges softened by water. 3 black SUVs moved in tight convoy formation down a narrow commercial street, their engines low and deliberate, the way predators move through unfamiliar territory. They stopped at the corner of a block lined with aging storefronts, a dry cleaner with a handwritten sign, a pharmacy with a flickering fluorescent light, a convenience store where a teenager stood under the awning checking his phone. Sandwiched between the pharmacy and an empty unit with brown paper taped to its windows was a small bakery. The sign above the door read Amara's in clean brushed gold lettering, with a small illustration of a cupcake beneath the name. The window was warm with yellow light. The display case inside held tiered cakes decorated with flowers made of buttercream, croissants arranged in careful rows, a dozen small tarts lined up like soldiers. It looked like the kind of place that had no business existing on this street. The middle SUV's rear door opened. Jang Tae-hyun stepped out. He was 37 years old, lean in the way that came not from vanity, but from a body that had been put through things no body should survive. The kind of lean that was more scar tissue than muscle. He wore a dark gray coat over a charcoal suit, no tie, his collar button undone. His face was the kind of face that photographs never quite captured right. Broad jawline, a nose that had been broken once and reset imperfectly, eyes that held a stillness most people found deeply unsettling. He wasn't handsome in any soft or approachable way. He was striking the way a closed door in a dark hallway was striking. You noticed it. You didn't know whether to open it or run. His head of security, a heavy-set man named Oh Sung-jin, stepped out behind him and moved to flank him automatically. Tae-hyun stopped walking. He didn't look at Sung-jin. He said, "Stay with the cars." Sung-jin hesitated. That hesitation cost him nothing. He'd known Tae-hyun for 11 years and had learned when pushback was acceptable and when it wasn't. This was not an acceptable moment. "Sir," he said, and stepped back. Tae-hyun crossed the wet sidewalk alone and pushed open the bakery door. A small bell chimed. The warmth hit him first, the kind of deep, specific warmth that only existed in places where something had been baking for hours, where heat had soaked into the walls and the wood and the air itself. Then the smell. Vanilla, browned butter, sugar at the edge of caramelization. Something floral underneath. It was a smell that belonged to a different kind of life than his. A life where the worst thing that happened to you on a given Tuesday was burning a batch of croissants. He stood just inside the doorway, rainwater dripping from the hem of his coat onto the hexagonal tile floor. The bakery was small. 4 round tables with mismatched chairs, a handwritten chalkboard menu on the wall behind the counter, a glass display case lit from within. Children's drawings had been taped to the wall beside the counter. Crayon landscapes and wobbly figures, and one that appeared to be a very ambitious attempt at a rainbow cake. And they covered so much of the wall that the wallpaper beneath was almost invisible. There was music playing softly from somewhere in the back. Old R&B, something slow and aching that Tae-hyun didn't recognize. He walked to the counter. There was no one behind it. A half-finished cake sat on a rotating stand on the prep surface, pale yellow layers waiting for frosting. A piping bag had been set down mid-task, its tip leaving a small swirl of buttercream on the surface of a sheet of parchment. Someone had been interrupted. He reached the counter and waited. Then she came out of the back room. She was carrying a tray of small tarts, her attention on the tray and not on the front of the shop, and she was saying something over her shoulder to someone still in the back. Something like, "Just put the smaller ones on the cooling rack, I'll come back for them." And her voice was exactly the same. Lower than you'd expect for a woman her size, with a slight American flatness to the vowels that 5 years in Seoul had not entirely smoothed out. Her hair was pulled back. She was wearing a flour-dusted apron over dark clothes. She set the tray down on the prep surface and reached for the piping bag before she registered the presence of someone at the counter. She looked up. Jang Tae-hyun looked at her. The air in the bakery changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the way a room changed when something stopped. The music kept playing. The rain kept hitting the window. But something that had been running quietly underneath all of it for 5 years lurched to a halt. Zuri Coleman's hands went still on the piping bag. She was 34. She had the kind of face that had never been soft. Exactly. Strong features, deep-set eyes, a quality of attentiveness that made it seem like she was always reading something in the air 2 inches in front of her. She had been beautiful at 29, the night they'd met at a corporate reception in a Gangnam hotel, and she was still beautiful now, but it was a different kind of beautiful, harder won, less naive, carrying more knowledge than any face should have to hold. For 3 full seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she said, very quietly, "We're closed. The sign says open until 8. His Korean was exactly as she remembered it. Low, measured, never wasted. "It's 7:42. "We're closed early." He didn't move. "Zuri?" Her jaw tightened. She set the piping bag down with more care than the moment required, as if giving her hand something to do. "You need to leave. I came for a wedding cake order. My assistant booked it under... I know what name it was booked under." She looked at him directly now, and there was something in her eyes that was not fear. Or not only fear. It was older than fear. It was the face of someone who had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 quiet spaces and had never quite managed to finish the rehearsal. "I accepted the order before I knew it was you. And now that you know, now I'm closing early." She moved toward the side of the counter where the pass-through was, and her body language was saying, "I'm coming around this counter, and I'm walking you to the door, and you're leaving." Her body language was very controlled and very deliberate, and it was doing exactly what she needed it to do, except for one thing. Her hands were shaking. Taehyun saw it. He didn't say anything about it. The door to the back room burst open. The little girl was 5 years old, maybe just turned 6, and she came through the door at the particular velocity that belongs only to small children who have been waiting patiently for long enough that patience has fully expired. She was wearing a butter yellow t-shirt and leggings with small stars printed on them, and she was holding a piece of paper in both hands, extended toward her mother like an offering, and she was already talking before the door had fully swung. "Mommy, Mommy, look what I drew. I drew the whole bakery, and I put you in it, and I put the cake, and I put..." She stopped when she saw the man standing at the counter. Children have a particular ability to read the temperature of a room that adults spend years learning to suppress. This child had clearly inherited something of her mother's perceptiveness, because she went quiet immediately, and her eyes moved from the stranger to her mother and back to the stranger with the rapid assessment of someone trying to determine whether something was wrong. "Mommy?" she said, more quietly. Zuri had crossed the floor in the 3 seconds it took the girl to appear, and she was beside her now. One hand on the girl's shoulder, her body angled slightly in front of her in the automatic geometry of a woman who had spent 5 years putting herself between her child and whatever came through a door. "It's okay, baby. Go back in the back for just a minute, okay? I'll come look at your drawing in a second." The girl didn't go. She was looking at Tae-hyun. He was looking at her. The girl had her mother's rich brown skin, her mother's wide forehead, her mother's way of holding her chin slightly lifted. But her eyes were his. There was no question, no ambiguity, no softening of that fact. She had the particular fold of his mother's eyes and the particular stillness of his own gaze, and it looked at once entirely natural on her face and like something that reached through Tae-hyun's chest and closed around something vital. The piece of paper she was holding was a crayon drawing. He could see it from where he stood. A lopsided rectangle that was probably the bakery. Yellow scribbles that were probably light in the windows, and 2 figures, one tall, one small, drawn with the earnest imprecision of a child who had been practicing but wasn't there yet. Under the tall figure, in blocky letters, she had written Mommy. Tae-hyun's mouth had stopped working. Zuri's hand tightened on the girl's shoulder. "Amara, back room, now!" Amara looked up at her mother, looked at the man, seemed to perform some internal calculus. Then she turned and went back through the door, glancing once over her shoulder before it swung shut behind her. The bakery was silent, except for the rain and the soft R&B from the back room. Taehyun said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way a building changes when something load-bearing shifts inside it. How old is she? It wasn't a question. Zuri's face was completely still. You need to leave. How old? Taehyun. How old is she, Zuri? He said her name like it had weight, like saying it was something he'd been carrying for a long time and had only just put down. Zuri exhaled through her nose. Her jaw was working. She looked at the floor, then at him. And when she looked at him, her eyes were dry and hard and absolutely wrecked at the same time. 5, she said. She'll be 6 in March. The math was simple. He did it without wanting to. He did it, and the answer landed in him like something dropped from a height. I was pregnant when I left, Zuri said. Her voice was flat. Not because she was unfeeling, but because this was the version of herself she'd had to build to survive. The version that could say the impossible thing out loud without the floor going out from under her. I didn't know until a few weeks after I was already gone. Taehyun put one hand on the counter. Just one hand, flat on the glass, the way a man puts his hand on a wall when the room tilts. You raised her alone. Yes. 5 years. Yes. He looked at the door to the back room. She doesn't know who I am. No. What have you told her? I told her father couldn't be with us. Zuri's voice didn't waver on this, but something moved behind her eyes, something that had been sitting in the dark for a long time. I told her it was complicated. I told her he wasn't a bad man, just... She stopped. I made a choice about what she needed to believe. That I was complicated, he said, with a specific flatness. That she was loved. That's what I made sure she believed. Her chin came up slightly. The rest of it, that could wait until she was old enough. The old R&B from the back room had shifted to something softer. Through the window, the rain blurred the lights of the street into impressionist streaks. Taehyun was quiet for what felt like a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different in a way he clearly couldn't control. I need you to tell me what happened, all of it, the real version. Why? Because I spent 5 years believing you were a traitor. The word came out like it tasted bad. I need to know if that was true. Zuri looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was difficult to read, the way difficult terrain was difficult to read, with too many layers and too much history. Finally, she said, The bakery closes in 15 minutes. I'll get Amara settled in the apartment upstairs. A pause. Then we can talk. Taehyun nodded once. He went to sit at this table farthest from the counter, near the rain-streaked window, and he sat with his coat still on and his hands flat on the table and looked at nothing in particular while he waited. Outside, he knew Sung-jin would be watching the door. He knew the 2 SUVs were idling in the rain. He knew that in 3 weeks, he was supposed to marry Park Seo-yeon, the daughter of a National Assembly member, in a ceremony that would be covered by every society page in the country and would quietly consolidate the Jang organization's political protection for the next decade. He knew all of that. He sat with it for a moment. Then he sat with the image of a little girl with his eyes holding up a crayon drawing. The bakery closed at 8. He heard Zuri moving through the space, turning off the display case lights, speaking softly to Amara in the back room. At one point, the girl laughed at something. A full, unguarded laugh. The kind of laugh that had no idea a man with wet shoes was sitting 30 feet away trying to remember how to breathe. When Zuri came back out, she had taken off the apron. She sat down across from him, not close enough to suggest intimacy or trust, but close enough that they could speak quietly. She told him. She had been inside the Jang organization for 14 months when it happened. Not as a full member, but in the gray zone where she'd always existed, an outsider who knew too much, trusted enough to be useful, never quite trusted enough to be safe. She had helped Taehyun with 3 legitimate business negotiations, had served as translator twice, had learned the shape of the organization the way you learn the shape of a house you live in, gradually, without trying to, just by being there. The accusation had appeared 2 months after Taehyun's father's first hospitalization. A dossier. 4 pages. Photographs of Zuri meeting with a man she'd never seen before, allegedly a courier for the Shin Syndicate. Encrypted communications attributed to an email account she had never owned. a financial transfer record, allegedly from a Shin front company, to an account in her name at a Singapore bank, an account she had never opened, had never heard of, and which she only saw for the first time on page 3 of that dossier. She told him she'd been shown the dossier by one of his senior capos, a man named Park Byung-ho, 3 days before Tae-hyun himself had confronted her with it. She told him she'd told Byung-ho it was fabricated, that she could prove it, that she needed to talk to Tae-hyun directly. She told him Byung-ho had smiled and told her she would get her chance. She never got her chance. By the time Tae-hyun came to her with the dossier, the narrative had been running for 72 hours. 3 of his most trusted people had already confirmed the evidence to him independently. The Singapore account had a transaction history that went back 4 months. When she told him it was a lie, he'd looked at her with those still, dark eyes, and she'd known, in the way you know things you'd rather not know, in the cellular level of understanding that bypasses language, that he'd already decided. Not because he wanted to believe it, because believing it was the easier choice for a man who was about to inherit an empire and could not afford doubt. She'd left that night. She hadn't known she was pregnant for another 19 days. His mother, Tae-hyun said. He said it quietly, without inflection, but something happened in his face that Zuri couldn't quite name. She looked at him. What? My mother. He was looking at the table. She was the one who, I know. Zuri's voice was steady. I figured it out eventually. Not right away. I was too busy surviving to do the math. But eventually. She looked at her hands on the table. She came to me. He looked up. When? 3 weeks after I left Seoul. I was in Busan. She found me. Zuri's voice was completely flat now. Not emotionless, but armored. She knew about the pregnancy before I'd told anyone. I don't know how. She knew, and she sat across from me in a coffee shop and she told me what would happen to my daughter if I came back. A pause. She was very specific. The silence in the bakery was complete. She told me a mixed-race child, a girl, a child with no standing in the organization. She said Amara would spend her life as a liability, a vulnerability, something that enemies would use. Zuri exhaled. She said if I came back, she would make sure Amara never lived to see her second birthday. Tae-hyun's hand had closed into a fist on the table. I believed her, Zuri said. I want you to understand that. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I didn't leave because I was afraid for myself. I left because she looked at me across that table and she meant it. She meant every word. The fist on the table didn't move. And you, Zuri said, and now her voice had something different in it. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had been waiting 5 years for an audience. You chose the empire. Tae-hyun said nothing. I needed you to fight for me. I needed you to look at that dossier and think, this isn't right. I needed you to know me well enough to know I wouldn't. She stopped. She looked out the rain-streaked window. When she turned back, her expression was composed. But you didn't. You made your choice. I was told you'd confessed. Zuri blinked. What? Byung-ho told me you'd confirmed the account, that you'd been approached by the Shins 6 months earlier and had been passing information to protect your own family in America. He said it flatly, watching her face. He told me you cried when you did it, that you'd been trying to figure out how to tell me. The quiet that followed had a different texture. I never confessed to anything, Zuri said. I never met with Byung-ho more than once. I know that now. Did you look for me? After? A muscle in his jaw moved. Yes. For how long? A pause. 6 weeks. Then my father died, and the organization was... He stopped. There were other priorities. Zuri nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she'd always suspected rather than learning something new. 6 weeks, she said, not with bitterness, but with a specificity that was almost worse. I didn't stop thinking about you, he said. The words came out like they'd been pulled out of somewhere they'd been stuck for a long time. I want you to know that. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I didn't stop. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, What do you want, Tae-hyun? You came in here for a wedding cake. You're getting married in 3 weeks. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the door to the back room, where his daughter was asleep, or nearly asleep, on the other side of a wall, in a life he hadn't been part of, in a world that had been built without him. I want to know her, he said. She doesn't know you exist. I know. You can't just... Zuri stopped herself. She pressed her fingers flat on the table like she was steadying something. She's not a piece of your empire, Taehyun. She's a child. She has a routine. She has a world. She has a mother who has been everything she needs. If you walk into her life and then walk back out because it's inconvenient, or because the organization demands it, or because your mother says something, if you do that to her, I won't. You don't get to just say that. I know. His eyes were still. I know I don't get to just say it. I know I have to earn it. I'm asking for the chance to start. The rain was lighter now. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off and then went silent. Zuri looked at him for a long time. She looked at his hands on the table, the scar across his left knuckle from a night she remembered in a way she wished she didn't. She looked at the way he was holding himself, controlled, as always, but with something underneath the control that she recognized. She'd seen it once before, on the night his father had his first stroke. It was the face of a man who had run out of armor. She wakes up early, Zuri said finally. She'll want to show you her drawings. Something moved through Taehyun's face that he didn't try to stop. I'm not saying yes, Zuri added. I'm saying, come back. Come back, and we'll figure out the next step. One step at a time. He nodded. He stood, buttoning his coat. He looked one more time at the door to the back room. Then he walked to the front door of the bakery and pushed it open and stepped back out into the Seoul rain. Sungjin was beside him in 3 seconds. Sir, everything all right? Taehyun stood on the wet sidewalk with the rain on his face and said nothing for a moment. Cancel the wedding cake order, he said. Cancel the account. Sungjin's voice was carefully neutral. Sir? The park wedding. Cancel everything. He walked toward the SUV. And get me Byung-ho's schedule. Sungjin fell into step beside him, and if he had questions, which he did, many, the kind that would have kept a lesser man up for weeks, he kept them to himself. He had known Taehyun for 11 years. He had seen him end business partnerships, order the removal of senior members, survive a shooting in the basement of a restaurant in Itaewon, and sit through his father's funeral without blinking. He had never seen him look the way he looked right now, like something had been cut loose from him. Like something that had been lodged in his chest for 5 years had finally been removed, and the wound where it had been was still raw and open and complicated. But it was clean, at least. Clean in a way things hadn't been for a long time. Sungjin opened the rear door of the SUV and said nothing. Taehyun got in. The convoy moved. The bakery behind them was still lit, a warm yellow square against the wet city dark. And inside it, Zuri Coleman was standing at the prep counter with her hands in flour, her jaw set, her eyes unfocused on the middle distance, doing whatever it was she did when the world required her to hold too many things at once. She was still standing there 20 minutes later when her phone buzzed on the counter. An unknown number, Seoul area code. She looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she answered. His voice said, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the evidence. Every detail. The Singapore account number, the photographs, the date stamps on the communications. Everything. Zuri's hand tightened on the phone. Why? Because Byung-ho is going to answer for this, and I need it to be irrefutable. A pause. I need him to have nowhere to go. This isn't about the organization, she said. This can't be about the organization. It's about my daughter. The simplicity of the statement stopped her. It's about the fact that she grew up without a father because someone inside my organization decided she was a liability before she was born. It's about the fact that I believed a lie for 5 years because I was too afraid of doubt to look harder. His voice was low and steady and completely without the performance of emotion, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. It's about making sure that whoever did this cannot ever, ever be close to her again. The flour on Zuri's hands had gone dry. She looked at the door to the back of the bakery, where Amara's light was still on, where the sound of a children's show murmured softly through the wall. She said, I need you to understand something first. Tell me, if you do this, if you come back into our lives, there's no half measure. You can't be Amara's father on weekends and an organization man the rest of the time. You can't put her second, not once. Not for any deal, any meeting, any obligation your people put in front of you. Her voice was quiet, but each word was exact. She has been the most important thing in the world to me for 5 years. That doesn't change. That will never change. And if you can't say the same, she is. He didn't hesitate. She is the most important thing. A long silence. The Singapore account, Zuri said finally, was numbered 87432. She was still talking 20 minutes later, her voice low and precise. While upstairs in a small apartment above the bakery, her daughter slept with a crayon drawing on the pillow beside her. A lopsided building, 2 figures, a rainbow cake. And outside, in the cold, wet dark, the city of Seoul moved around them all. Indifferent as cities are, its millions of lights burning on without knowing or caring that something had just cracked open in a small bakery in Mapo that would never fully close again. Fully. What neither of them knew, not yet, was that the conversation was being recorded, and the man listening to it, in the back seat of his own car parked half a block down the street, was already reaching for his phone to make a call. Park Byung-ho had been with the Jang organization for 19 years. He had survived 3 leadership transitions, 2 gang wars, and a prosecution that had somehow resulted in 0 convictions. He had not survived this long by being slow. He dialed. The call connected on the second ring. He found her, Byung-ho said. His voice was very calm. And she told him everything. A pause on the other end of the line, then a woman's voice, measured, precise, carrying the particular authority of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, said, "How much does he know?" "Enough." Byung-ho watched the lit window of the bakery in the rain. "He's going to come for me." Another pause. "Then we move first," the woman said. "Tonight." The call ended. Byung-ho lowered the phone and looked at the bakery one more time. The warm yellow light, the gold lettering of the sign, the name Amara's above the door. Then he told his driver to go. The call ended at 11:47. Zuri stood at the prep counter with the phone still in her hand, the screen dark, and listened to the sound of the building settling around her. The bakery was quiet in the specific way that commercial spaces went quiet after hours. A deep, structural silence that had nothing soft about it. The display case lights were off. The chairs were up on the tables. The only light came from the single pendant lamp above the prep surface and the pale strip of light under the door to the back staircase. She set the phone down. Her hands were steady. She was aware of this in the detached way that she'd learned to be aware of her own body during moments of high stress, cataloging it, noting it, the way a pilot notes instrument readings during turbulence. Hands steady, breathing shallow, jaw tight, heart rate elevated but controlled. She was fine. She was absolutely not fine. She picked up a dish towel and wiped the residual flour from her hands and thought about what she'd just done. She had given Jang Tae-hyun the account number, the photograph descriptions, the date stamps, the name of the man who had approached her in Busan 2 days after the accusation, a man she now understood had been sent by Byung-ho to surveil her, not by the Shins. She had given him everything. 5 years of carefully held information, released in 20 minutes over a phone call in a dark bakery to a man she hadn't spoken to since the night everything broke. She pressed the heels of her hands against the edge of the prep counter and looked at the ceiling. The question she hadn't asked herself yet, the one she'd been too careful not to ask while she was on the phone, surfaced now in the quiet. What if she'd just made it worse? Tae-hyun with information was one thing. Tae-hyun with information and a cause was something else entirely. She knew what he was. She had always known what he was. The thing that had drawn her to him 5 years ago, that absolute, unsentimental commitment to whatever he decided mattered, was the same thing that had let him believe the dossier without fighting harder for the truth. When Tae-hyun pointed himself at something, it went away. People, problems, obstacles of any size. She had found that quality magnetic when it was pointed outward. Now she'd pointed it at Park Byung-ho. She exhaled, turned off the prep light, went upstairs. Amara was asleep on her side, one arm wrapped around a stuffed animal of indeterminate species that had been loved into near formlessness. The crayon drawing had slipped off the pillow and was on the floor beside the bed. Zuri picked it up, looked at it for a moment in the thin light from the hallway, and set it on the small desk by the window. She stood over her daughter and watched her breathe. The child slept the way she did everything, completely, without reservation, her whole body committed to the task. Her hair was still in the 2 puffs Zuri had done that morning, slightly escaped, a few coils loose around her face. One hand was curled near her chin. Zuri sat on the edge of the bed, very carefully, and didn't touch her. Just watched. She thought, he looked at you for 30 seconds, and already couldn't breathe. She thought, that's either the best thing or the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to us. She didn't know which. She went to her own room and lay on top of the covers fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around 2 in the morning when she finally slept. She dreamed about the dossier. She always dreamed about the dossier. Across the city, in the 43rd floor of a residential tower in Gangnam, Jang Tae-hyun stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his apartment with a glass of water he hadn't drunk and looked at Seoul spread beneath him. The Han River was a dark ribbon cutting through the lights. He could see the bridges from here, 5 of them in a row, lit orange and white, traffic moving across them in both directions at this hour, because the city never entirely stopped. His phone was on the kitchen counter behind him. He'd made 2 calls after the one with Zuri. The first to his private investigator, a man named Choi who was meticulous and expensive and had no particular loyalty to anyone beyond whoever was paying him at a given moment. The second to his own attorney, a woman named Jung Ha-yoon, who had never once shown surprise at anything he put in front of her and who had confirmed in very precise language what he already knew. If the evidence against Zuri had been fabricated, and if he could prove provenance, the consequences for the people responsible would be significant. Significant was Ha-yoon's word. She was conservative with language. What she meant was catastrophic. He stood at the window and let the information settle. Park Byung-ho, 19 years with the organization. A man who had attended Tae-hyun's father's funeral and wept with visible sincerity and had stood at Tae-hyun's right hand through the transition. A man Tae-hyun had trusted with the kind of information that, in the wrong hands, could bring down half the legitimate businesses the organization held as cover. He turned it over and looked at it from every angle and came back each time to the same question. Why? Not whether. The why. Byung-ho didn't do anything without reason. He was not a man of impulse or ideology. Everything he did was transactional. So who had he been transacting with 5 years ago when he built a paper trail that framed an innocent woman and drove her out of the country? The answer was not yet clear. But the shape of it was there. The shape of it had been there for years, in the corner of Tae-hyun's vision, in the small inconsistencies he'd chosen to leave unexamined because examining them would require looking at things he hadn't been ready to look at. He picked up the glass of water. He didn't drink it. He set it back down. His phone lit up. A message from Sung-jin. Byung-ho canceled his 7 a.m. tomorrow, rescheduled to next week, no reason given. Tae-hyun read it twice. He replied, "Don't let him leave Seoul." Then he went to the bedroom and slept 4 hours and woke up with his jaw already tight, which was how he always woke up when something was moving. The next morning was cold and clear, the rain gone, the sky the particular pale blue that appeared over Seoul in autumn, like the city had been freshly washed. Tae-hyun was at the Jang organization's primary legitimate business address, a glass and steel building in Yeouido that housed an investment management company, 4 subsidiary firms, and a law practice. By 7:15. He went in through the underground parking structure, bypassed the main reception, and was in his private office on the 31st floor before any of his senior staff arrived. He sat at the desk and opened the secure file Ha-yun had sent him at 5 a.m., the Singapore account. He looked at the number Zuri had given him, 8 digits, institution code, routing number, and cross-referenced them with what Ha-yun had found in the original dossier documentation. They matched. He hadn't doubted that they would, but the visual confirmation of matching numbers in a document he'd read 5 years ago and a phone conversation from last night produced a specific quality of nausea that he sat with for a moment before setting it aside. The photographs in the dossier had shown Zuri meeting with a man outside a coffee shop in Gangbuk. He pulled the originals from the physical archive his predecessor's office had kept, locked in a fireproof cabinet behind a painting in the conference room, the kind of relic left over from an era of paper documentation. He spread them on his desk. The man in the photographs was not a Shin Syndicate courier. Tae-hyun had known this man's face for 11 years. He was younger in these photographs, his hair darker, but the jaw was unmistakable. The man in the photographs with Zuri was one of Byung-ho's own drivers. He sat with this for 60 seconds. Then he picked up his phone and called Choi. "How fast can you get me the entry and exit records for a Singapore banking account from 5 years ago?" Choi said, "Depends on whose cooperation I'm working with. Work without cooperation. Faster that way." A pause. 24 hours, maybe less if the trail is sloppy." "It'll be sloppy," Tae-hyun said. It was a setup job, not a long-term construct. They built it to hold for 30 days. After that, they didn't care. He ended the call. At 9:15, his senior capo counsel arrived for the weekly operations meeting. There were 7 of them, men ranging in age from 38 to 64, each responsible for a different sector of the organization's activities, each carrying the specific wariness of people who had learned long ago that the ground could shift without warning. They filed into the conference room. Tae-hyun was already seated at the head of the table. Byung-ho's chair was empty. Nobody commented on it for the first 20 minutes of the meeting. Standard business. Revenue summaries. 2 personnel issues. A territory question in Incheon that had been simmering for weeks. Tae-hyun moved through it all with his usual efficiency, nothing in his face or voice indicating that the meeting was anything other than routine. Then, at 9:40, he put the photographs on the table. He didn't explain them. He set them in the center of the table, face up, and let the 6 men present look at them. The silence that followed had a very specific quality. It was the silence of people doing rapid calculations. Kim Do-jin, the oldest man in the room, said carefully, "Where did these come from?" "My archive." Tae-hyun looked at him. "They were in the dossier on Zuri Coleman, the one that was presented to me 5 years ago as evidence of her contact with the Shin Syndicate." He paused. "The man she's meeting with in that photograph drove for Park Byung-ho from 2018 to 2021. Another silence. Longer this time. Lee Sang-woo, who ran the organization's northern operations and had always been the most politically cautious man in the room, said, "Tae-hyun-si, this is a significant accusation." "It's a photograph," Tae-hyun said. "The accusation comes later when I have the financial documentation." He looked around the table. "I'm telling you now as a courtesy, not because I need approval." The temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. Do-jin said, "Byung-ho has 19 years with this organization." "I know. If this moves forward without more evidence, it will have more evidence." Tae-hyun collected the photographs. "Within 24 hours, possibly less." He looked at each man in turn, briefly, the way you checked a room when you entered it. "If anyone here has information relevant to what happened 5 years ago with the Coleman matter, now is the time. After today, it becomes more complicated for everyone." The offer was explicit, and the implication behind it was equally explicit. Anyone who had known and stayed quiet was choosing, in this moment, which side of the line they stood on. The room was quiet. Nobody said anything. Tae-hyun nodded once. "Then we're done." He was out of the conference room by 10:15 and in the elevator when his phone rang. Not Choi, not Hae-yun. The number was his mother's private line, a number she used only when she needed something she didn't want to route through intermediaries. He let it ring. It rang again 30 seconds later. He let it ring again. The third call came as he reached the parking level. He stood beside his car, looked at the screen, and answered. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it from every difficult conversation of his life. Composed, precise, the warmth in it so carefully calibrated that it took years to learn to hear how controlled it was. "Tae-hyun, we should talk." "Yes," he said, "we should." "Come to the house this evening. I'll have dinner." "I won't be coming to the house," he said. "If you want to talk, come to the office. During business hours, like anyone else." A pause. Not a long one. His mother was not a woman who allowed herself long pauses. But it was there. "What's happened?" "Nothing yet." He opened the car door. "That's why you should come soon." He got in. Sung-jin pulled into traffic without asking where they were going. He'd been briefed. The call from Zuri came at 11:40. "There's a man," she said. No preamble. "He's been outside since about 9, different spots, across the street, then down by the pharmacy. Now he's back across the street. He bought a coffee and he's been standing there for 2.5 hours. Tae-hyun said, "Don't go outside." "I wasn't planning to." Her voice was flat and controlled, and he could hear, under it, the specific kind of alertness that a person developed when they'd been running for a long time. "Amara's school starts at noon on Wednesdays. I need to take her." "Don't take her today. She has a..." "Zuri." He said her name in a way that wasn't a command but was close to one. "Don't take her today. I'll have someone there in 15 minutes. They'll stay outside the building. Don't let Amara near the windows." A pause. He heard her breathe. Is this Byung-ho? Most likely. He's escalating fast. He knows I'm moving. Tae-hyun was already texting Sung-jin the address. He canceled his morning. He's spooked. And spooked men do stupid things, or fast ones. He looked out the window at the city moving past. 15 minutes, Zuri. Don't open the door for anyone who isn't one of my people. How will I know which ones are yours? They'll say my name. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. You want me to open my door to a stranger because he says the name of the most feared crime boss in Seoul. You understand how that sounds. Despite everything, something moved through his chest that was almost, not quite, but almost, the ghost of amusement. They'll also show identification, with my company seal. That I can work with? A pause. Tae-hyun. Yes. Be careful about your mother. The car went quiet. He watched a food delivery driver weave between lanes on a scooter. What do you know? I know she was the one who came to Busan. Zuri's voice was careful. I know Byung-ho didn't build that dossier because he had a personal problem with me. He needed a sponsor. Someone with authority to direct the timing, to access your father's transition period as cover, to make sure the accusation reached you before you had a chance to hear from me directly. A pause. He was carrying orders, Tae-hyun. He didn't do this alone. The silence in the car was very complete. Tae-hyun said, I know. And I need the financial evidence first. I need the account provenance. I need the documentation to be irrefutable before I move on anyone above Byung-ho. His voice was steady, but his hand on the phone was not. Because if I move too fast and they have time to clean up, there's nothing. And then it's just a son making an accusation against his mother with no proof and within the organization that reads as instability, which gives them grounds to remove you. Yes. Another pause. When Zuri spoke again, her voice was quieter. How long have you known? He thought about the answer. He thought about the years of small inconsistencies he'd let lie, the decisions his mother had made during the transition period that he'd accepted because grief made everything slow, and because she was his mother, and because the alternative was too large to sit with. Long enough, he said. Not long enough. That's not an answer. No. He watched the city out the window. It's not. At 12:30, one of Tae-hyun's protection detail arrived at the bakery. A woman named Yoon Ji-soo, compact and quiet, who showed Zuri a card with the company seal and stood outside the building's front entrance and did not move for the next 6 hours. The man across the street left within 40 minutes of her arrival. He didn't come back. At 3:15, Choi sent a message. I have the account data. You should see this in person. Tae-hyun was at Choi's office in Mapo by 4. He sat across from the investigator at a desk covered in printed documents and looked at what Choi had found without speaking for 3 full minutes. The Singapore account had been opened in Zuri's name using a forged identity document, a forgery good enough to pass casual bank scrutiny in 2019, but not good enough to survive a forensic examination. The IP address used to manage the account remotely traced back, through 3 proxy servers, to a device registered to a telecommunications plan in the name of one of Byung-ho's holding companies. The fund transfers, 4 of them, totaling just over 40 million won, had originated from a series of shell accounts that Choi had spent 6 hours tracing. The originating account, the one at the top of the chain, belonged to a private investment trust. The trust was administered by Han Young-ja, Jang Tae-hyun's mother. Choi watched him read it. He had the professionalism to say nothing. Tae-hyun sat in the chair across from the desk and looked at the document for a long time. He was very still. His breathing was even. His face was absolutely composed. Inside, something that had been hanging by a thread for 19 years finally cut. That was the word that came to him. Not broke, not snapped. Cut. Clean and surgical and without drama. The way a wire went when it had been bearing too much weight for too long, and one morning simply separated at the weakest point, and the tension it had been holding released all at once into nothing. He folded the document in half. Choi watched him do it. The investigator had the particular stillness of a man who had delivered bad news to dangerous people many times and had learned that the seconds immediately after delivery were the most unpredictable. He kept his hands visible on the desk. He did not speak. Tae-hyun stood. He put the folded document into the inside pocket of his coat. He looked at Choi with an expression that communicated nothing at all, which Choi understood to mean a great deal. The backup copies, Tae-hyun said. Encrypted. Off-site server. You have the access key. Destroy your local copies. All of them. Choi nodded. Already planned to. Tae-hyun put cash on the desk. He still paid Choi in cash, always had, because it was the only currency that left no narrative behind. He buttoned his coat. He walked out. In the elevator down, he stood alone and looked at the brushed steel door and felt the document against his ribs through the coat fabric. His mother's trust, her administrator's signature on the originating account. 40 million won routed through 4 shells to a fraudulent account in the name of the woman he had loved in order to make the lie look real enough to hold. The elevator reached the ground floor. He stepped out into the late afternoon light. He thought of his mother sitting across from Zuri in that Busan coffee shop. Her posture impeccable, as always. Her voice measured. She would have been wearing something dark and well-tailored. She would have ordered tea she didn't drink. She would have looked at the pregnant woman across the table, his pregnant wife carrying his child, and she would have spoken with the same composed precision she brought to every difficult conversation, and she would have described in clear terms what she would do to the child. He stood on the sidewalk outside Choi's building and felt this. He stood with it for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and breathe out. Then he called Sung Jin. Bring the car around and call ahead to the house. Tell them I'm coming for dinner. A pause. Sung Jin said, Sir, are you sure that's... Call ahead, Tae-hyun said. I want her to know I'm coming. The house was in Seongbuk-dong, up in the quiet hills north of the city center, behind a wall and a gate and a garden that his father had designed and his mother had maintained for 30 years with the same controlling precision she brought to everything. It was a large house, traditional in its bones with modern renovation, and in the evenings it was lit warmly from within and looked from the street like the kind of home where uncomplicated things happened. Tae-hyun had grown up inside those walls. The gate opened before his car reached it. They always knew when he was coming. He got out in the courtyard and went inside without waiting for anyone to meet him at the door. His mother was in the main sitting room. She was dressed for the evening in the understated, expensive way she was always dressed. Dark slacks, a silk blouse, her silver hair pinned back. She was sitting with a cup of tea that she had clearly poured in advance, and her posture was exactly as he'd imagined it in the elevator. Upright, composed, giving nothing away. She looked at him when he entered and she said, You should have come sooner. He sat down across from her without removing his coat. The room was quiet. A housekeeper moved somewhere in the back of the house, distant enough to be irrelevant. The garden lights had come on outside the window, illuminating bare autumn branches. The Singapore account, he said. Youngja Investment Trust. Account number... I know what account, she said. He stopped. She held her tea in both hands and looked at him with the expression he had seen his entire life. The one that had no bottom to it, that looked like calm because she had made it look like calm for so long that the effort had become invisible. I always knew you would find it eventually, she said. I expected you to find it years ago, honestly. You were never as incurious as you pretended to be. The admission, delivered without flinching, without the degradation of excuse or explanation, hit him differently than rage would have. He sat very still. Tell me why, he said. You know why. Tell me anyway. She set the teacup down on its saucer with a precise click. Because she would have destroyed you, she said. Not deliberately, not even consciously, but a mixed marriage, a foreign wife, a mixed-race child, in the middle of the transition period, with your father dying, with 3 rival organizations watching to see if the Jiang succession would hold, she was a fracture point. She was something they could use. She looked at him with absolute steadiness. I removed the fracture point. You framed my wife. I protected my son. You threatened my unborn daughter. Something moved through her face at this. Small, quickly suppressed, but there. I told the woman that a child in that position would face difficulties, she said carefully. I made her understand the reality of what the organization would mean for a child of her background. You told her you'd have the baby killed before her 2nd birthday. His voice was completely even. Those were your words. Zuri remembered them exactly. His mother's expression did not change, but she picked the teacup back up, and the way her fingers adjusted on the porcelain was the tell, the one crack in the composure. The woman needed to leave, she said. She needed sufficient motivation. And you paid Byung-ho to build the dossier. Byung-ho understood what needed to happen. Did he understand it before or after you paid him 40 million to one through 4 shell companies? She met his eyes. The organization required stability. You required stability. You were 20 years old when your grandfather died and you fell apart for 6 months. I watched what grief did to you. You couldn't afford to do that again. Not in the middle of succession. Her voice held no apology, no softness, the pure, unyielding logic of a woman who had made a decision and had spent 5 years constructing the architecture of justification around it. I made a hard choice. I made it for you. You made it for the organization. For you. The organization is you. It has always been you. Tae-hyun looked at her for a long moment. At the face he had known his entire life, the face that had been the fixed point of every difficult thing he'd survived. His grandfather's brutality, his father's coldness, the years of being forged into something the organization could use. She had been the one constant. And he understood now, sitting in the room where he had grown up, that the constancy and the damage had always been the same thing. I have a daughter, he said. She said nothing. Her name is Amara. She is 5 years old. She has spent her entire life without a father because you decided she was a liability before she was born. He watched his mother's face. You have a grandchild you have never met. Tae-hyun, I'm going to ask you one question, he said, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. She waited. Is Byung-ho acting alone right now, or are you still directing him? The pause was short, but it existed, and he had spent his entire life learning to read her, and the pause told him everything. He stood up. There's a woman outside my daughter's building, he said. If anything happens to them, anything. The documents go to every prosecutor, every journalist, and every rival organization simultaneously. He buttoned the top button of his coat. I will burn everything we built to the ground before I let you touch them. She looked up at him. For the first time in his memory, she looked her age. You would destroy 40 years. In a second, he said, without blinking. He walked out. In the car, he called Sung Jin before the gate had fully closed behind them. Move Zuri and Amara, tonight. I have a building in Yongsan, the residential tower, floor 22. It's registered under the holding company. Take them there. Don't tell anyone else where they are. Sung Jin said, Jisoo is still outside the bakery. Tell her to start the move in the next 30 minutes. He looked out the window at the dark hillside roads of Seongbuk-dong. Don't use the company vehicles. Rentals. Personal plates. Understood. And Byung-ho? I know where he is. He did. Choi had tracked Byung-ho's phone to a restaurant in Gangnam, a private dining establishment that catered to the kind of clientele who needed their meals to be unremarkable. He had been there for 2 hours. He had arrived with 2 men. Tae-hyun said, Tell Do-jin I need him. Just Do-jin. No one else. Kim Do-jin was the oldest man in the council, 64 years old, and he had been with the organization since before Tae-hyun was born. He was not warm, not sentimental, not anyone's idea of a friend. But he was a man who had survived every political shift the organization had gone through by being, above all else, someone who understood that the institution mattered more than any individual inside it. When Tae-hyun needed a witness to what was about to happen, he needed someone the rest of the council would believe. Do-jin met him in the restaurant's private parking structure at 8:15. He was wearing his coat over what looked like interrupted dinner clothes, and he looked at Tae-hyun with the eyes of a man who had already figured out the broad shape of the evening. How bad? Was all he said. Bad enough. Tae-hyun handed him copies of the documents. Not originals. Ha-yun had the originals, but clean copies with the account numbers highlighted and the trust documentation paperclipped to the front. Read it on the way up. They took the private elevator to the dining room reserved under a false name. Byung-ho was sitting at the far table with his back to the wall. The old instinct, the one they all had. And he saw Tae-hyun come through the door, and he did something he had never done in 19 years of operating in high-pressure rooms. He reached for his phone. Tae-hyun crossed the room in 8 steps. He took the phone off the table before Byung-ho's hand reached it, turned it off, and set it in his own coat pocket. He sat down. Byung-ho's 2 men had stood. Tae-hyun didn't look at them. He said, Sit down. in a voice that was quiet and absolute, and after a moment they sat down. Dojin took a chair at the adjacent table, far enough away to be a witness and not a participant, and opened the documents. Byung-ho looked at Tae-hyun across the table. He was a man of 53, heavy-set, with the composed surface of someone who had long ago learned to suppress tells. But the restaurant was well lit, and Tae-hyun was watching his eyes, and his eyes were doing rapid calculations that his face was working hard to conceal. Tae-hyun-si, Byung-ho said. His voice was careful, warm, even, the voice he used in council meetings when he wanted to sound reasonable. Whatever you've been told, the account, Tae-hyun said, the Youngja Trust, the 4 shells, the forged identity documents. He laid no paper on the table. He didn't need to. Your driver in the photographs was Zuri Coleman. Byung-ho said nothing. The warmth in his voice went away. I want to know one thing, Tae-hyun said. Not the what. I have the what. I want to know whether you understood when you built the dossier that she was pregnant. The question landed in the space between them and sat there. Byung-ho's jaw moved once. Then he said, that was not information I had at the time. When did you have it? A pause. Later. Before or after she left Seoul? Another pause, longer. Before. Tae-hyun sat with this. Across the table, Dojin had gone very still with the documents in his hands. So you knew, Tae-hyun said. You knew she was pregnant. You knew she was carrying my child, and you let her run. The decision to approach her in Busan was not mine, Byung-ho said, and now something was shifting in his voice, the composure developing fault lines, not from guilt, because Tae-hyun didn't believe Byung-ho felt guilt in any form he'd recognize, but from the calculation that honesty, here at the end, might buy something. That was directed from above my authority. My mother. He nodded once. And the threat against the child. I was informed of the conversation afterward. He met Tae-hyun's eyes. I want you to understand. I did not endorse that. But you didn't stop it. I did not have the standing to stop it. Tae-hyun looked at him for a long time. He looked at the man who had stood at his right hand for 11 years, who had attended every council meeting, every sensitive operation, who had helped him consolidate power after his father's death, who had, all that time, been carrying the knowledge of what he'd helped do to a pregnant woman and a child who had never been given the chance to exist inside her own father's life. You have 2 choices, Tae-hyun said. You can give me everything, every communication, every financial record, every instruction you received from my mother over the last 5 years that relates to this matter. Everything. In writing, notarized by tomorrow morning. He paused. Or I give what I already have to the NPA tonight, and you spend the next decade explaining a fraudulent Singapore account to prosecutors who are very interested in the Jang organization's financial infrastructure. Byung-ho's face had gone the color of old concrete. The first option, Tae-hyun continued, keeps you out of a cell. It does not keep you in this organization. You are finished here regardless, but you walk away clean. Your family is not touched. Your assets are not examined. He held Byung-ho's gaze. The second option is what it is. Dojin set the documents down on the table beside him. He had read enough. Byung-ho looked at his hands. He looked at the 2 men sitting with him, who were looking carefully at nothing. He looked at Tae-hyun. He said, I'll have it to you by morning. Tae-hyun stood. He took Byung-ho's phone from his pocket and set it on the table, powered off. He looked at Dojin. Dojin stood, folded the documents, put them inside his coat. They left. In the elevator down, Dojin said, Your mother. Yes. This is going to split the council. I know. Sang-woo and at least 2 others have been close to her since your father's illness. They'll read this as a move against them. I know that too. Dojin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you need? 24 hours to get the documentation secured. After that, I need the council to hear it from you, not from me. Coming from me, it's a family matter. Coming from you, it's a governance matter. Dojin looked at him. You're asking me to be the one who stands up in that room and says your mother bought a capo to destroy evidence and threaten an unborn child. Yes, that is a significant ask. I know. I'll do it, Dojin said. The elevator reached the ground floor. But you should understand, once this is in the room, there's no path back to what we were. The organization will come through it, but it won't look the same. It shouldn't look the same, Taehyun said. They walked out into the parking structure. The night was cold. Somewhere above them, through the layers of concrete, the city was doing what it always did. Taehyun's phone buzzed. Sung Jin. They're in the car, 10 minutes out from Yongsan. He exhaled. Then the second message came in, 30 seconds behind the first, from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It was a photograph. Taken from a distance, slightly blurred but clear enough, it showed the front of the Yongsan residential tower. And standing in the lit entrance lobby, visible through the glass, were Sung Jin and Yoon Ji-soo, and a small figure in a yellow coat and a woman beside her with her hand on the small figure's shoulder. They had already arrived. Someone had known where they were going before they got there. The caption under the photograph was 4 words. It said, "She looks like him." Taehyun stared at the screen. The parking structure was silent. Dojin, who had started walking toward his own car, turned and looked back at the expression on Taehyun's face and stopped. Walking stopped. Taehyun's thumb moved across the screen. He tried to trace the number. Unknown. Routed through something that would take Choi 20 minutes to unpack, and whoever sent it knew that. He called Sung Jin. 1 ring. "Sir?" "The lobby, right now. Take them up. Do not stop moving until you are inside the apartment with the door locked." A beat. Then Sung Jin's voice, lower, the shift that happened when he understood the register had changed. "Copy. There's someone watching the building. I don't know how many. I don't know positions." Taehyun was already moving toward his own car, Dojin 2 steps behind him, reading the situation from body language alone. "Get them upstairs. Call me when the door is locked." Moving now. The call stayed open. Taehyun got into the passenger seat, gestured for his driver to go, and listened to the ambient sound of Sung Jin moving through a lobby, the soft chime of an elevator, the sound of Amara asking something in a small voice, Zuri saying quietly, "It's okay, baby. We're going up." And then the elevator doors closing and the line going briefly static. 22 floors. He counted them by the seconds. Dojin had gotten into the car behind his. His driver was on the phone. The 2 vehicles pulled out of the restaurant's parking structure into the Gangnam night, moving north toward the Han. Sung Jin's voice came back. "Doors locked. We're in." Taehyun exhaled through his nose. "How many exits in the building?" "Main lobby, service entrance in the back, parking level B2, roof access is keyed. Get someone on the service entrance, someone I trust, not building security." He was already thinking through the roster, who was available, who was clean of his mother's influence, who hadn't had time to be turned. The list was shorter than it should have been. Jisoo stays inside the apartment. Done. Put Zuri on. A pause. A different quality of silence, and then Zuri's voice close to the phone, low and controlled. "I'm here. Someone sent me a photograph of you and Amara in the lobby, taken from outside." A beat. "How recent." "You were still in your coats." She absorbed this. He could hear her thinking. The particular quality of her silence when she was processing, which he remembered from 5 years ago and which had not changed. "Amara is in the back bedroom," she said. "I told her we're having an adventure sleepover. She bought it." "Good." Tae-hyun. Her voice dropped another register. "How bad is this?" He looked out the window at the Han River coming into view as they crossed onto the bridge, the dark water below, the city lights on both banks. He thought about the photograph. He thought about the 4 words underneath it. He thought about the fact that whoever sent it had tracked a vehicle registered to a holding company that only 6 people knew existed. One of those 6 people had spoken to his mother in the last 12 hours. "I'm working on it," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not. I'll call you when I know more. Don't open the door for anyone. Not the building manager, not someone who says they're police. Nobody. I know how this works. I know you do." He ended the call. Dojin's voice came through the car's intercom from the vehicle behind. "I've been making calls. Sang-woo left the city this afternoon. His wife says he went to Jeju for business. He doesn't have business in Jeju." Taehyun processed this. Lee Sang-woo. Northern operations, close to his mother since the father's illness. Had been in the council meeting this morning when Taehyun laid the photographs on the table. Had been in the room when Taehyun said he would have the financial documentation within 24 hours. "He told her," Taehyun said, "before you even left the building, I'd guess." "Who else?" I don't know yet. Dojin paused. But someone gave up the Yongsan address. That's not a leak from your side, but Sungjin is clean, Jisoo is clean. That leaves whoever registered the holding company. Ha Yun, his attorney. She had registered 3 of the holding companies. She had been with his organization for 8 years. He did not want to believe it, and belief had nothing to do with it. I need to talk to Hae Yun, he said. Dojin said, carefully, yes. He called her. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was awake and had been waiting, which meant something either way. Her voice was its usual, precise, professionally warm register. Taehyun Si, I was going to call you in the morning about the documentation. The Yongsan Tower, he said. Who else has the registration documents? A pause. Too short to be guilty, too present to be nothing. My office holds the originals. My paralegal has filing copies. Why, your paralegal. Name. Park Ji-young. She's been with me for 3 years. She's completely... Is she related to Park Byung-ho? Dead silence. Ha-eun. She's his niece. The words came out clipped, each one its own contained thing. I hired her through a placement agency. I ran background. She was clean. Her name was different. I didn't connect. Did she have access to the Yongsan filing today? She would have filed the quarterly amendment this afternoon. Yes. Taehyun closed his eyes for 2 seconds, opened them. The bridge was behind them now, the car moving through the North Bank streets. Where is she now? She left at 6. I can try to reach... Don't try to reach her. Don't contact anyone until I call you back. Do you understand? Yes. Hyun's voice had dropped all its professional warmth. What was underneath was a woman who understood exactly how much trouble she was in and was choosing, in real time, how to navigate it. Taehyun-si, I didn't know. I want to be clear. I'll call you back, he said, and ended it. He looked at the city moving past the window and did the arithmetic. Byung-ho's niece in Ha-yoon's office. The address leaked within hours of Zuri and Amara arriving. The photograph sent to his personal number, which was not on any public document anywhere. Someone close enough to know his number, or close enough to someone who did. His mother had been building contingencies for years. He had known this intellectually. He had not understood the depth of it until this moment, sitting in a moving car at 9:30 in the evening, feeling the architecture of it rising up around him. Not like a trap exactly, but like a building he'd been living in his whole life, whose full-floor plan he was only now seeing. He called Sung Jin again. I need the building swept. B2 parking, service corridor, the floor below 22. I need it done quietly, and I need it done now. I only have Jisoo and Park in the building. Call in Ryu, off the books. Sung Jin paused. Ryu was not organization. He was a man who did specific work for specific payment and maintained no affiliations, which made him unusable for most things and essential for moments like this one. He'll want double. Pay it. 20 minutes later, the car pulled up to a building in Jongno where Do-jin kept an office he used for meetings that didn't go on any calendar. They went up to the 3rd floor. Do-jin poured 2 glasses of water that neither of them drank. They sat at a table and Taehyun laid out what he had. The documentation, the Byung-ho conversation, his mother's admission, the Yongsan leak. And Do-jin listened with his hands flat on the table and said nothing until it was complete. Then Do-jin said, "She's going to move against you. Not just politically. You understand that?" "Yes." "Byung-ho gave you until morning, but she knows what he's going to give you. She's been planning for the version of events where everything comes out." Do-jin looked at him steadily. She didn't survive 40 years in this organization by being unprepared for worst cases. What does she have? If Sang-woo is gone, he's activating the northern contacts. Those are 12 men. 6 of them are personally loyal to her. 3 of them are loyal to whoever's paying. 3 of them would follow the organization over any individual. Do-jin ticked through it with the patience of someone who had spent decades reading this specific game board. She also has 2 council members in Incheon who owe her protection for something I won't go into, and access to 2 sitting prosecutors through the political marriage that you just canceled. Park Seo-yeon's father. Assemblymember Park was deeply unhappy about the cancellation. He may have already spoken to her. Taehyun looked at the water glass. She could have Byung-ho picked up before morning, prevent him from delivering. Yes. Or she could use the Incheon contacts to move on the building. Also yes. Dojin's voice was very level. Tae-hyun, what do you want to do? He looked at the table. He thought about Amara in a back bedroom on the 22nd floor, believing she was having an adventure sleepover. He thought about Zuri's voice on the phone. I know how this works. The flatness of someone who had been living with this knowledge for 5 years, who had always known this moment would come, who had left a country and built a bakery and raised a child alone because the alternative was this exact configuration, this exact night. He thought about what he'd said to his mother in the sitting room, under the garden lights, in the house he'd grown up in. I will burn everything to the ground. I need Byung-ho secured, he said. Tonight, not tomorrow. If she moves to silence him before morning, I lose the documentation and I have my copies against her admission, which she will deny and I can't prove she made. He looked at Dojin. I need someone to bring him in. Somewhere she can't reach him. Where? My building in Mapo. Basement level. It's not in any of the holding company documents. It's in my personal name, bought before the organization knew to track my assets. He stood. I'll go to the Yongsan building. I need to be there. Dojin looked at him. That's where she'll expect you to be. I know. He picked up his coat. But Amara is there. I'm not going to be somewhere else. There was a pause, and Dojin looked at him with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Some long-held assessment of who this person was, being revised in real time. He said nothing about it. He picked up his own phone. I'll handle Byung-ho. Tae-hyun was out the door in 30 seconds. The drive to Yongsan took 16 minutes. He went through 2 traffic lights he shouldn't have. His driver did not comment. Sung-jin met him in the B2 parking level with the tight posture of someone managing multiple problems simultaneously. Ryu found something in the service corridor on floor 21, he said immediately, walking as he talked. A device. Small. Either audio or tracking. He couldn't tell on sight. Get it out of the building. He's on it, but if they put one in, they probably put more. Sung-jin hit the elevator button. The parking level is clean. Main lobby has 1 camera that's been tampered with, and someone rerouted the feed. It's showing a loop of footage from 2 days ago. They wrote up. How long has the feed been looped? Best estimate, about 4 hours. 4 hours. Before Zuri and Amara had arrived. Before Sung-jin had made the rental car calls. 4 hours ago, someone had already known this building was going to be used tonight. The elevator opened on 22. Jisoo was in the hallway outside the apartment door, and she had the look of someone who had not moved from that spot since she arrived, and did not intend to. She gave Tae-hyun a single nod. He knocked. 3 times. A pause. 2 more. The pattern he'd told Sung-jin to pass to Zuri. The door opened. Zuri stood in the doorway in the clothes she'd been moved in, her arms crossed, her jaw set. She looked at him with eyes that had been doing what they always did, reading the room, reading him, pulling data from the quality of his posture and the set of his shoulders and whatever showed in his face that he thought he was suppressing. She looked at him for 3 seconds. How bad? She said. Bad, he said, but manageable. That's what you said on the phone. It's still true. She stepped back and let him in. The apartment was large and impersonal, the kind of space that had been furnished with efficiency rather than comfort. Clean lines, neutral colors, the particular blankness of a place that had never held a family. Zuri had already done something to it in the hour she'd been there, in the way that people who were used to creating habitable spaces out of nothing did instinctively. A light on in the kitchen to warm the main room. Amara's small bag unzipped on the couch with a stuffed animal propped against a cushion. From the back bedroom, faintly, the sound of a children's show on a tablet. Zuri looked at him. Tell me. He told her. Not all of it. Not the full scope of the council fracture. Not Dojin's assessment of the numbers. But enough. The Yongsan address compromised. The building device. The camera feed tampered 4 hours before their arrival. His mother's reach being longer and more prepared than even he had accounted for. Zuri listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened, her body very still and her eyes on him the whole time. When he finished, she said, She's going to make a move on the building. Possibly. We don't know the timeline. Then we need to not be in the building. He looked at her. Where? Somewhere she doesn't know. Zuri uncrossed her arms. Think. Is there anywhere that's genuinely not in any document, not in any file she could have access to, Not in any conversation she could have monitored. He thought, the house in Gyeonggi-do, his grandfather's original property, the one before the family moved to Seoul, the one that had been in his personal name since his grandfather's death, and had never once been connected to the organization because his grandfather had deliberately kept it off every asset record for tax reasons that were ancient history. It had been sitting empty for 6 years. He'd never sold it because there was some inarticulate resistance that made him keep it. Yes, he said. One place. Then that's where we go. She turned toward the back bedroom. Zuri? She stopped. There may be people watching the building exits, he said. Moving in a vehicle is a risk. She turned back around and looked at him with an expression that was not patience exactly, but was something more durable than patience. The expression of a woman who had already survived the hardest version of this and knew what it cost and was choosing it anyway. She threatened my daughter before she was born, Zuri said. I have been afraid for 5 years. I have been hiding and running and making Amara believe that being careful was just how life worked. Her voice was even and it was final and it had no room in it for negotiation. I'm done hiding. If we have to move, we move. But I'm not sitting in a room that she already knows about and waiting for whatever she sends. Mam ishimkitamin. He looked at her for a long moment. Get Amara ready, he said. She went. He called Sung Jin. We're moving. Gyeonggi-do property. You have the address? My grandfather's name on the deed? Search your files from when we did the estate review in 2021. Sung Jin was quiet for a second. How many vehicles? 1. Registered to nothing. He watched Zuri come back out of the bedroom with Amara, who was in pajamas, sleepy-eyed, clutching the formless stuffed animal and looking around with the alert curiosity of a child who understood that something was different but had decided to reserve judgment. Exit through B2. Ryu takes point. Jisoo rides with us. 10 minutes, Sungjin said. 10 minutes. Taehyun looked at his daughter. Amara looked back at him with the direct, unfiltered assessment that children brought to strangers, cataloging him without social filter, without the learned politeness that taught adults to look away. She had met him once, for 30 seconds, in a bakery, and she had gone back through a door. Now here she was again, in a strange apartment at 10 o'clock at night, in her pajamas, being asked to trust a sequence of events she didn't have the information to evaluate. She looked at him. She looked at her mother. She looked at him again. Are we going on a trip? She asked. Yes, he said. In the night? Yes. She considered this. Do I get to stay up late? He looked at her. Something in his chest did what it had been doing intermittently since the moment he first saw her eyes in a bakery. A physical thing. A tightening and releasing. Like a muscle he hadn't known he had being used for the first time. Yes, he said. You get to stay up late. Amara nodded seriously, as though this was a satisfactory negotiated outcome, and pulled the stuffed animal tighter under her arm. Zuri was watching him. When his eyes moved to her, she looked away. Not quickly, not guiltily, but with the deliberate quality of someone choosing not to show what was on their face. He understood. He looked away too. Sungjin appeared in the hallway doorway. Cars ready? They moved. The B2 parking level was empty and cold, their breath showing in the underground air. Ryu was a tall, quiet man who operated with the economy of someone paid for efficiency rather than conversation. He scanned the level once, nodded, and got into the lead position. Jisoo took the rear seat beside Amara. Zuri got in front. Taehyun got in beside the driver. The car moved. They came up out of the parking level into the Yongsan street, and Taehyun watched the building recede in the side mirror and scanned the street in both directions out of reflex. Cars, a food delivery scooter, a couple walking a dog, a van parked 20 meters ahead on the right. He looked at the van. White. No markings. Engine off, but the exhaust pipe showed a faint heat shimmer in the cold air, which meant it was running. He said, Ryu. Quietly. Ryu had already seen it. He took the next left without indicating, smooth and unhurried, the way you made a turn when you didn't want to announce that you'd made a decision. The van didn't move. Ryu took another left, another, a wide loop. They came back to the main road 2 blocks south of the building, and Taehyun looked back. The van was still parked, hadn't followed. Surveillance, then, not intercept. They were watching the building, not the exits. because they expected him to be inside it. He looked forward and said nothing. The city thinned as they drove south and then west, the density of apartment towers giving way to smaller buildings, and then to the wider roads and darker skies of the outer districts. Amara fell asleep against Jisoo's arm before they reached the expressway, the stuffed animal still tucked under her chin, her breathing going slow and even, with the totality of a child who had decided the situation was safe enough to release into sleep. Zuri was looking at the road ahead, her elbow against the window, her hand over her mouth in the way people held themselves when they were thinking hard about something they weren't ready to say. They drove. 40 minutes out of the city, Tae-hyun's phone buzzed. Do-jin. Byung-ho is secure. He's talking. I need you to hear what he just told me, he called Do-jin. Do-jin picked up, and the sound of his voice measured, always measured, but carrying something underneath it that Tae-hyun had never heard before. A quality of controlled alarm that on Do-jin was the equivalent of shouting, stopped Tae-hyun's breath in his chest before the first word was fully formed. The dossier on Zuri Coleman, Do-jin said. Byung-ho built it on orders. We knew that. What we didn't know. A pause, and in the pause, Tae-hyun heard the sound of paper, documents, a man reading something aloud from notes. Is that the operation didn't end when she left the country. The car moved through dark, outer city roads. Amara slept. Zuri's hand was still over her mouth. What do you mean it didn't end? Tae-hyun said. The Singapore account, Do-jin said. It was never closed. It's been active, low-level activity, designed to look dormant but traceable if someone looked hard enough. Byung-ho has been maintaining it on standing orders. Bullshit. He paused. The account has Zuri Coleman's name on it, and 2 weeks ago, 48 hours after you placed the wedding cake order under the company account, which triggered an automated flag in their monitoring system, someone made a transfer. 800,001. Coming in. Tae-hyun went very still. Whoever monitors that account, Do-jin said, knew you'd found her before you walked into that bakery. They've been watching the account for 5 years, waiting for exactly this trigger. He paused one more time. And Byung-ho says the standing order to maintain the account came from your mother, but the monitoring, the automated trigger that was set up by someone else. Who? Do-jin said the name. And Tae-hyun looked at the dark road ahead and understood, with the particular cold clarity that arrived when the last piece of a structure revealed itself, that the fracture in the organization was not a fracture at all. It was a foundation, and it had been laid before the organization existed. The name Do-jin said was Jung Ha-yoon, his attorney. 8 years. The woman who had filed every holding company, structured every legitimate acquisition, built the legal architecture that made the Jang organization's surface look clean. The woman he had called the night he found Zuri. The woman he had trusted with the documentation that was supposed to end this. He said, how long? Do-jin said, Byung-ho thinks from the beginning. Before your father died, she was placed. By who? He doesn't know. He says he only understood she was monitoring, not who she reported to. The instruction to set the account trigger came through a channel he'd never used before or since, a single message. He followed it because the authentication code was your mother's. But you don't think it was my mother? Do-jin was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Your mother builds walls. She doesn't build traps that take 8 years to spring. This is someone else's architecture. Tae-hyun looked at the dark road and thought about Ha-yoon's voice on the phone earlier. Her paralegal. Her 3 years. Her background check. The performance of a woman discovering something she hadn't known, delivered at exactly the right speed with exactly the right degree of alarm. He had been listening to her read from a script, and he had believed it because he was already moving and because he'd known her for 8 years, and because the mind resisted its own worst conclusions. Where is she now? He said. We don't know. He ended the call. Zuri had not moved. Her elbow was still against the window, but her hand had come down from her mouth and was now flat on her thigh, and she was looking at the side of his face with the quality of attention she gave things when she was deciding whether to speak. She said, Who is it? My attorney. He kept his voice level. In the back seat, Amara was still sleeping, her breath audible in the car's quiet. She's been embedded for 8 years. Embedded by who? I don't know yet. Zuri looked forward. The road was dark and the headlights swept over bare trees on both sides, the outer edges of the Gyeonggi farmland beginning to replace the last thin sprawl of the city. She said, "If she had the documentation you gave her, she has it. Then whoever she reports to has it." "Yes, which means moving you was the goal. Getting you out in the open, away from the organization's infrastructure, with the documentation in their hands." She turned and looked at him directly. "This was never about your mother. Your mother was the lever. Someone used her." He looked at her. She said, "Who benefits most if the Jang organization destabilizes?" He thought about it. He thought about it the way you thought about a structure you'd been inside so long you'd stopped seeing its shape, having to step back mentally and look at the whole outline. 3 rival organizations. 2 of them were manageable. The third, the Choi Syndicate, operating out of Busan with significant reach into legitimate financial markets, had been attempting to acquire Jang-adjacent territory for 3 years and had been blocked each time by the organization's political protection. The protection that came from Assemblymember Park, the political marriage that Tae-hyun had just canceled. "Choi," he said. Zuri said nothing. She didn't need to. If Ha-eun had been placed by the Choi Syndicate 8 years ago, the architecture made sense. A long game, a slow accumulation of access, waiting for a trigger point, the succession, the marriage, the moment when the organization was politically exposed. The Singapore account was not just a weapon against Zuri. It had been a dormant instrument, maintained and monitored, waiting to be activated when the Choi Syndicate needed a crisis inside the Jang organization. The trigger had been the wedding cake order, his name in a bakery's appointment book. Someone in the Choi network had seen it and sent the signal, and Ha-eun had activated the account transfer, and the photograph had come to his phone from a number that Ha-eun had. She had his number, she had always had his number, and the whole edifice had begun to move. He had walked into the bakery looking for Zuri and had walked out carrying a bomb he hadn't known he was holding. He called Sung-jin. "Ha-eun," he said, "find her, physically. Don't call her, don't message her, just find where she is right now. And when we find her, don't approach, just locate. And call Dojin. Tell him I need the documentation copies that Ha-eun received to be treated as compromised. He needs to move the originals to the secondary location we discussed." He put the phone down. The Gyeonggi property appeared at the end of a narrow road between fields, dark and low against the sky. An old farmhouse that had been a wealthy man's retreat 40 years ago and had been empty long enough to feel like a place the present hadn't reached. Ryu pulled through the gate. The headlights swept across the courtyard, the low stone wall, the persimmon tree that had been there longer than Tae-hyun had been alive. He got out. The air was cold and still and smelled of turned earth and nothing else. Jisoo carried Amara, who had not woken, in Kisei and put her on the old couch in the main room under a blanket she found in a cedar chest. Zuri stood in the doorway of the main room and watched her daughter's face in sleep for a moment, then turned and came back to where Tae-hyun was standing by the kitchen window, looking at the dark courtyard. "What now?" she said. "Now we wait until morning," he said. "When Byung-ho's documentation is delivered and Dojin presents it to the full council. Once it's in the room, in front of everyone, my mother loses her leverage inside the organization. Without the council, she has no mechanism to act. And the Choi connection, Ha-eun's placement, once I can prove it, goes to the NPA directly, not through any channel she has access to." He paused. "It becomes a criminal matter, which takes it out of the organization's hands entirely." Zuri leaned against the counter and crossed her arms and looked at him in the way she'd been looking at him all night, with the assessment of someone who had known him deeply once and was now recalibrating what she knew against what she was seeing. "You've been planning this in your head since the car," she said. "Since Dojin's call, yes. And your mother." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the persimmon tree stood against the sky, its bare branches holding the cold. "She'll have to leave the organization," he said. "Formally, with documentation of what she did going into the council record." He looked at the tree. "Whether she faces any legal consequence depends on what Byung-ho's statement covers and what the prosecutors decide to pursue. She threatened to kill my daughter." "I know. That's not something you walk away from," Zuri said. Her voice was not raised, was not trembling, was not asking for anything. It was stating a fact with the authority of someone for whom the fact was non-negotiable. "I know," he said again. "She won't walk away from it. I won't let that happen." He turned from the window and looked at her. I want you to know that I won't let that happen. Zuri held his gaze. She looked at him for a long moment, reading everything she could read in his face, the way she always had, efficiently, without sentimentality, taking the measure of what was actually there rather than what she wanted to find. Then she nodded once. She went to the main room and lay down beside Amara on the couch and closed her eyes. Taehyun sat in the kitchen and watched the courtyard until the sky began to go gray. The morning came in slowly, the way winter mornings came in Gyeonggi, reluctant and pale, light creeping over the flat fields without drama. By 6:15, Do-jin had the full council on a secured call. By 6:50, Byung-ho's notarized documentation had been transmitted to 3 separate secure locations. By 7:30, when Sung-jin called to report that Ha-yun had been located at a hotel in Incheon, not near the airport, not near the port, but in a district where the Choi Syndicate maintained 2 front businesses, the shape of the night's architecture was fully visible in the morning light. She had not been running. She had been waiting to be collected. Taehyun directed the NPA contact, a prosecutor he had been cultivating for 2 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with this situation and everything to do with the fact that he'd always understood leverage required patience, to the hotel address. The contact asked no questions. She was good at her job. Ha-yun was taken into custody at 8:15. She did not resist. She looked, by Sung-jin's account, like a woman who had prepared for this contingency, composed, already retreating behind the careful silence of someone who intended to say nothing without counsel. At 8:47, the council vote completed. Han Young-ja was removed from all organizational roles by a unanimous decision. Her assets held within the organization's structure were frozen pending review. The 2 council members who had been close to her, neither of them Sang-woo, who had not come back from Jeju and whose prolonged absence was itself a message, abstained rather than opposed, which was, in the language of that room, a form of surrender. Do-jin called Taehyun at 9:03. He said, "It's done." Taehyun was sitting in the courtyard of the Gyeonggi property, his coat on, a cup of tea he'd made from supplies he'd found in the back of a cabinet going cold in his hand. He said, "Any resistance?" "Less than I expected. I think they'd been watching the signs for longer than any of them admitted." A pause. Sang-woo called in at 8:30. He says he was in Jeju for personal reasons and had no part in last night's activity. I don't believe him, but I don't have documentation on him specifically, and frankly, at this point, the council wants stability more than it wants another investigation. We'll come back to Sang-woo. Yes. Do-jin paused again. Tae-hyun-si, what about the woman and the child? He looked at the persimmon tree in the gray morning light. They're safe, he said. For now. He ended the call and sat with the cold cup of tea and the bare tree and the silence that was, for the first time in approximately 30 hours, simply silence rather than the charged and threatening quiet of a situation with active moving parts. It was just the cold, the gray sky. The field beyond the wall turned brown at the end of the season. He heard the door behind him. He heard the specific sound of a child's footsteps, different from an adult's, lighter and less deliberate, the walk of someone who hadn't learned yet to move through a space quietly. Amara came around the side of the doorframe and stood on the low step that led into the courtyard, looking at him with the morning direct gaze of a child who had slept well and woken up somewhere unfamiliar and found this interesting rather than alarming. She was still in her pajamas. The stuffed animal was tucked under one arm. She looked at the courtyard, at the persimmon tree, at the empty fields beyond the wall, then at him. "You were here all night," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She stepped down into the courtyard. She walked to where he was sitting, and she stood in front of him, and she looked at his face with the particular attention she'd brought to him since the first moment she saw him, the look of someone taking careful inventory. Then she sat down on the low wall beside his chair, about 2 feet away, and pulled the stuffed animal into her lap. "Mommy said your name," she said. "When she was sleeping. She does that sometimes. Says the name of someone she's thinking about." He looked at her. "Does she?" Amara considered the tree. "She says it like she's trying to figure something out." A pause. "She thinks about things for a long time. She doesn't always say what they are." "She's careful," Taehyun said. "She worries." Amara said this with the calm authority of a child who had studied her primary person with great attention and knew the patterns. She doesn't let me see it, but I know. She looked at him sideways. Are you going to make her stop worrying? The directness of the question hit him somewhere in the solar plexus. He looked at his daughter, at the profile of her face in the gray morning light, the clean line of her forehead, the way she held her chin slightly lifted when she was thinking, exactly like her mother. And he said, I'm going to try. That means you don't know. It means I can't promise things I haven't done yet. He looked at her steadily. But I'm going to try every day until it works. Amara looked at him. She looked at the tree. She seemed to turn this over, hold it up to the light, examine it the way she examined everything. Then she said, okay, with the tone of someone granting provisional approval. They sat in the cold quiet for a while. The light was coming up slowly over the fields. Is that your tree? Amara asked. It was my grandfather's. The fruit is still on it. She was looking at the persimmons, a few remaining dark orange against the gray branches. They dry on the tree in winter sometimes. She looked at them for a while. Then she slid off the wall and walked to the tree and stood underneath it and looked up. She reached out one hand and very gently touched the lowest hanging fruit with her fingertips. She looked back at him over her shoulder. Can I have one? He stood. He crossed the courtyard and reached up and picked the lowest persimmon from its stem and handed it to her. She turned it over in her small hands, examining it with the same careful attention she brought to everything. Then she looked up at him, very close now, and for a moment the morning light caught her eyes at an angle that left him no shelter from what he saw there. His own eyes, in his daughter's face, looking at him without any of the armor that adults learn to wear. She said, Are you my dad? He crouched down so he was at her level. The cold ground, the bare tree, the pale winter sky above. He looked at her face, and he did not look away from it. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The persimmon was still in her hands. Mommy said you couldn't be with us, she said. Before. She was right. I couldn't be. He held her gaze. I should have found a way to be anyway. I'm sorry I didn't. Amara considered this with the gravity she brought to important things. Are you going to leave again? No. How do I know? You don't, he said. Not yet. You'll know because I'll be there, day after day, until you know. She looked at him. Something moved through her face. Something that was not resolution exactly, because 5-year-olds didn't work in resolution, but something more like the opening of a door that had been closed without her fully knowing it was closed. She looked down at the persimmon in her hands. She held it out to him. He took it. He understood. She was sharing it. He understood this was not a small thing. He produced a small folding knife from his coat pocket, the kind he'd carried for 20 years, and he cut the persimmon in half with the quiet efficiency of someone doing an ordinary thing. He gave her half. She ate it standing under the tree with the cold on her face and the juice on her chin, and she watched the fields going bright as the sun finally cleared the horizon and came in low and gold across the turned earth. He stood beside her and ate his half and said nothing. The door opened behind them. Zuri stood on the low step, still in yesterday's clothes, her hair loose, one shoulder against the doorframe. She looked at the two of them under the tree, at the persimmon half eaten, at her daughter's chin, at the man standing beside her. Her face was very still. She did not speak immediately. After a moment, she said, Come inside. It's cold. Amara turned and went inside without argument, the stuffed animal trailing from one hand. Taehyun followed. Zuri stepped aside to let them both in. As he passed, she said quietly, low enough for only him, I heard. He stopped, looked at her. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she would not cry now, and he did not expect her to, and did not need her to. What was in her face was something harder and more durable than crying. It was the face of a woman who had held a door closed against everything for 5 years, and was now, finally, very carefully, deciding whether to let it open. Are you done? She said. The organization, the thing with your mother, is it done? The immediate threat is resolved, he said. There's still the Choi connection to be prosecuted. There are still organizational pieces I'll be managing for months. I won't lie to you about that. But Amara is safe. Yes. And your mother can't come near her. No, she can't. Zuri looked at him for a moment. Then she said, What do you want? Not for the organization? Not for the council? What do you want? He looked at her. He looked at her the way you looked at something you'd been carrying the knowledge of for a long time and had only recently been allowed to set down in the light and examine. I want to know what she likes for breakfast, he said. I want to know what she's afraid of and what makes her laugh. I want to see what she's like at 6, at 7, at 12. His voice was level and it held no performance. I want to know you again. I want to earn that. I understand it takes time, and I'm not asking for pancakes, Zuri said. He stopped. She likes pancakes with banana on top. She's afraid of drains, like shower drains. She thinks something lives in them. I have no idea where she got it. She laughs at everything. Zuri's jaw worked once. You asked what she likes for breakfast. He looked at her. That's a start, she said. That's all it is right now. A start. She held his gaze with the absolute directness she'd always had, the quality that had stopped him the first night he met her and had never stopped being true. I'm not going to make this easy for you. You don't get easy. I know, but I'm not going to make it impossible either. She looked down for a moment at her hands, then back up. She deserves her father. She's always deserved her father. A pause. And you deserve to know her. Something in his face shifted, barely visible, but there, the way foundations shifted underground where you couldn't see them but could measure the effect at the surface. He said, Thank you. Zuri turned toward the kitchen. I'm going to see if there's anything to cook in this museum you call a house. He stood in the doorway and let out a breath that had been somewhere in his chest for a very long time. From inside the main room, Amara's voice calling out with the imperiousness of a child who had decided the adults were moving too slowly. Mommy, he said there might be fruit. Are there other fruits? I want to see. Zuri from the kitchen. Ask your father. A silence. Then, Daddy. The word came out of nowhere, not practiced, not offered as a gift, just deployed casually with the ease of a child who had made a decision and implemented it without fanfare. Like she had always used it, like it belonged in her mouth. Taehyun stood in the doorway, and the word hit him like nothing the last 30 hours had come close to. Not the documents, not the confrontations, not the photograph with its 4 words, not the cold arithmetic of the night's maneuvering. Just that. Just the word, from his daughter's mouth, in a farmhouse his grandfather had built in a field in Gyeonggi, on a cold morning with persimmon on her chin. He went into the main room. Amara was standing by the window looking at the fields. She turned when he came in. Are there other fruits? She said, as though this were the most urgent matter of the morning. In summer, he said. Plums. My grandfather grew them. You should grow them again. He looked at her. You think so? Then we could come back and pick them. She said it with the certainty of a child who had already decided this would happen, who had already placed it in the future as a fixed point. She turned back to the window and pressed her nose against the glass to look at the garden. He stood behind her and looked at the same garden, the bare plum trees at the far end, the same trees his grandfather had planted, the same trees that had produced fruit every summer of his childhood and every summer since without anyone to pick it. He looked at them in the winter morning light and thought about summer. He thought about what it would mean to have a reason to be here in summer. He thought about how a life was built, not all at once, not by deciding it, but by this, by standing in a room with the people who mattered and saying here and then being there again, until the days accumulated into something that held weight. Zuri came to the doorway of the kitchen. She had found flour. She was looking at him with the expression she had when she was trying not to show that something mattered to her, which he remembered from before, and which had always been legible to him no matter how well she composed it. You want to help? She said. I've never made pancakes. She gave him a look. Everyone has made pancakes. I haven't. Then it's time. She turned back to the kitchen. He followed. Amara came in behind him and climbed onto the counter stool and supervised both of them with the critical attention of someone who ate pancakes regularly and had strong opinions about the process. She told him he was stirring too fast. She told her mother the pan wasn't hot enough. She told him he could put the banana on top, but only in slices, not mashed, because mashed was wrong. He listened to all of it, and he stirred at the speed she specified, and he cut the banana into slices, and he stood in a farmhouse kitchen in Gyeonggi at 8 in the morning while the sun came through the window and put warmth on the old stone floor. And he made pancakes with his daughter supervising, and the woman he had never stopped carrying somewhere in his chest measuring flour beside him. And the morning came all the way in, unhurried, without incident. The terrible events of the night before had not disappeared. The Choi Syndicate case would run for months. The council would require months of careful management. His mother had gone silent since the vote, which was not peace but the particular silence before a reckoning that would, when it came, need to be faced. Sang-woo was still in Jeju. There was still work, years of work, and the foundation beneath all of it. None of that was resolved. All of it was real. But it was real outside this kitchen. And outside this kitchen, the sun was on the floor, and the pancakes were in the pan, and his daughter was counting the banana slices out loud to make sure there were enough. And in this kitchen, the most dangerous man in Seoul was standing with a spatula, doing what the 5-year-old told him, because she was right about the slices, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and that was enough for right now. That was the whole of the world for right now. Zuri looked at him sideways over the bowl of batter. She didn't say anything. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the courtyard doorway, with something opening in it that wasn't trust yet, not entirely, but was the thing that came before trust, the thing that was required before trust could take root. She looked at him with the beginning of it. He looked back. Amara said, "They're burning." He looked at the pan. She was right. He flipped them fast and they were not burned, just on the edge, the bottom a deep brown. The kind of deep brown that was either a mistake or exactly right, depending on who you asked. He looked at Amara. She studied the pancake with the seriousness of a judge. "Okay," she said. "That's okay." Zuri made a sound that was, quietly, a laugh. She covered it with the back of her hand. He caught it anyway. He held onto it like the persimmon half, like the word from the doorway, like the morning light on the old floor. The small things that accumulated, one after another, into something that lasted. Outside, the fields lay quiet under the winter sun. The persimmon tree held its last fruit against the cold. The plum trees at the far end of the garden stood bare but rooted, the way things stood that had survived many winters and expected to survive more, waiting with the patience of living things for the season to turn and the work of growing to begin again.